Welcome to the Capitol Forum's 6th Annual Antitrust Thought Leader video series. I'm Sally Hubbard, and I'm here with Lina Khan. Lina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here with you.
I want to talk to you about the top antitrust issues facing the tech platforms. Could you lay out what you think those top issues are?
Sure, I think there are a few. So one is the fact that these dominant platforms, Google, Amazon, are now effectively serving as infrastructure for other businesses. And that creates a relationship of dependence. But in addition to serving as infrastructure for other businesses, Amazon and Google are integrated in all these other lines, and that puts them in direct competition with the companies relying on their infrastructure. And I think that creates a core conflict of interest, is raising a bunch of anti-competitive concerns. I think another key issue is monopoly leveraging. So the way that Google, Amazon are able to use their dominance to expand into other lines of business and give themselves an advantage. I think another issue is predatory pricing. So the current legal doctrine assumes that predatory pricing is irrational and rarely ever occurs. But what we see with the platforms is that these markets are winner takes all. And so oftentimes it actually makes a lot of sense to prioritize growth over revenue and engage in schemes where you're actually engaging in what used to be considered predatory pricing. I think the last issue I'd point to is that we see huge information asymmetries. So the fact that these platforms are hosting all of this economic activity by other companies means that they collect a lot of information that they're then able to use oftentimes against those businesses in their vertical integration. So we see this with Facebook, with Amazon, with Google. And so I think the information asymmetries and the effects that that's having on competition is also significant.
So let's go through these issues one at a time. The first one is something that I try to give the term platform privilege, right? Where basically you have the platforms being competitors within their own platform, and then they're able to, well, that also relates to monopoly leveraging, right? It's kind of both those 2 points.
Right.
They also are then able to advantage their own services and products that they vertically integrated in their platform. Could you talk about some examples of tech platforms really controlling the infrastructure, or could you elaborate about that?
Sure. So Amazon is a dominant online platform. Over 50% of online shopping searches now begin on its website. It also has a massive logistics network where if you're an independent retailer and you want to, be able to be delivered in 2 days, you're going to be compelled to use Amazon services. And I think we see a lot of dependence. I mean, I've done interviews with merchants and producers that sell through Amazon, and they certainly feel that they don't have plausible options. So oftentimes they are subjected to practices that they think put them at a competitive disadvantage. But when they're weighing the choice between enduring the information extraction that Amazon is doing and just choosing not to be on Amazon's platform, they feel like they don't really have a choice. There have been a couple of merchants that have found their account suspended abruptly without really any explanation of why, and they've seen their sales dry up by 60-70%, and have considered laying people off. And so I think people are economically dependent on Amazon, and I think Amazon can take advantage of that bargaining power.
I've had merchants tell me that they'll be selling a particular product and it does well, and we know that Amazon has the data to identify those top selling products. And then Amazon itself will either manufacture the product as an Amazon Basics product or become a direct seller of the product itself, and then give itself top rankings in the search results or give itself the buy box. And so sellers have told me that when Amazon starts selling something that they were selling, they immediately liquidate their inventory. How can antitrust deal with a problem like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, in certain respects, I think there are a lot of analogies with some of the competition issues that platforms are presenting. But I think this information asymmetry one is one that is, if not novel, then at least showing up in a totally different form and much more difficult to address. We've seen how when in the context of certain vertical mergers, we'll see a consent decrees that require certain firewalls and prohibit information sharing between different lines of business because there's a recognition that there could be information misappropriation in ways that could harm competition. I think this is a context where it's much more difficult to police that just by virtue of the fact that these are digital platforms, that they're collecting information in all of these ways. And I think that's why, structural prohibitions or structural limits would make a lot of sense, because this is something that's so difficult to police and I think has, significant ramifications. There was a study by Harvard Business School that interviewed the sellers who kind of find their goods, their information appropriated by Amazon, and they found that it really does have a dampening effect on kind of entrepreneurship, on their inclination to continue expanding their business. And I think we're starting to see a huge disjunction between risk and reward, right? So you have these merchants that are undertaking the initial risk of bringing a product to market, but Amazon is able to swoop in when it sees something is doing well and kind of reap the reward. And I think that kind of disjunction between risk and reward is really bad. It's not something that is conducive to kind of a healthy open market and strong entrepreneurship.
Yeah, most definitely that would be bad for entrepreneurship and innovation if you don't feel that you're going to get the rewards for the risk that you undertake. And I think we've seen that in other contexts in the tech platforms where, for example, Snapchat would come up with a new innovation and then Facebook would just apply that innovation to its 2 billion users.
Right.
Right. So is that one of the main concerns that you think antitrust should be looking at when antitrust is trying to deal with the tech platforms? Is this kind of disincentive for innovation and entrepreneurship?
Absolutely. And I think in the context of Facebook, Facebook actually acquired a company, Onavo, that provides privacy and security to users, or that's how it's pitched. But internally, it also gives Facebook access to a lot of information around which rival applications are diverting attention from Facebook. And it's able to use Onavo to track in very close detail which rival apps are kind of gaining in popularity, and then is able to go out at the company's very earliest stages of growth and kind of make an aggressive acquisition bid, or just replicate the technology in-house. And this is a situation where the information asymmetry also becomes more clear, because oftentimes it's only Facebook that has knowledge about how potentially successful this other company could be, and it's able to kind of swoop in there, make an acquisition offer before any other acquisitions might be on the table, and before enforcers might even fully realize the potential competition issues here. So I think this is definitely something that antitrust should be paying attention to.
And that's where potential competition doctrine would also need to come into play, and not current kind of framework for it has to be a merger of a certain size, or they have to have a certain market share in order for it to be meaningful, because if they can snuff out that competitive threat at its very inception, that's quite an effective way to foreclose competition, right?
Absolutely.
So you think that potential competition doctrine also needs to be shored up or revised?
I think that's right. I mean, I think if you're thinking about kind of theories of harm in this way, I think the fact that these companies are able to snuff out potential competitive threats really kind of chips away at the idea that when you have a dominant company, that company is always checked by potential competition, right? There's this idea that even when a company attains market power, it's unlikely to abuse that power, because if ever it would, then you would see this flood of new entrants that would kind of discipline. I think that theory needs to be revisited in light of the fact that we see how platforms are in fact able to, squash out those nascent competitive threats.
And you also mentioned monopoly leveraging as one of the top antitrust issues involving tech platforms. What do you think needs to happen in law governing monopoly leveraging, or how do those issues play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to kind of Section 2 issues more generally, and kind of revisiting how the doctrine has made it much more difficult to actually bring successful Section 2 cases. I know there's some uncertainties about the degree to which monopoly leveraging, kind of what the requirements are, and there are kind of different circuit opinions on that. So I think action by the agencies that would attempt to clarify that, or at least show that they still think monopoly leveraging is a valid theory, would help move things forward.
And I know there's some case law, I think it's Matsushita, that says that if you're leveraging into a new market, you have to show likelihood of success of monopolizing that market. And the courts have required a showing of 50% market share to demonstrate likelihood of success. To me, that kind of defeats the whole purpose, right? I mean, once the tech platform has gotten 50% market share in the adjacent market, or the market they're leveraging their monopoly into, isn't it game over at that point?
Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, I think this gets to a larger question around kind of the prophylactic orientation of certain antitrust statutes and laws. And there was, there's definitely language, both, in certain court decisions and in some of the legislative history that shows that Congress really intended for these laws to be able to halt concentration in its inception. And I think that kind of framework is something that we should also be looking at when thinking about things like monopoly leveraging, that you want to, halt some of these practices from the get-go.
Right, and there used to be the incipiency standard, right, for merger enforcement, where you could look not just at the merger before you, but also all the ones down the line. And it doesn't seem like that's been really being applied, and it seems like it really needs to be when we look at, I think I counted the tech platforms had acquired something like 800 companies. I think Facebook and Google alone have acquired 800 companies. At least.
That sounds right. Yeah, and I think comparatively, Amazon had been had not been as aggressive in the past about acquiring, but that changed last year. Starting in 2017, it really upped its acquisitions, and I think now that we're seeing the AI space get more competitive, both Google and Amazon are kind of making aggressive acquisitions in that space to try and be the leaders in that frontier too.
And the AI space is something that's going to unleash a whole other set of these competition issues in terms of monopoly leveraging and information asymmetry. I mean, with the Echo in everyone's home, right? Amazon getting access to information that others don't have, but then also being able to, if people start shopping with their voices. Right. There's been some tests already. I think it was L2 that showed an example of saying, Alexa, buy me batteries, and the only batteries ever recommended were Amazon batteries.
Right.
Right. So it's going to be almost another platform that will allow these same kind of concerns that we've had with like Google search and things like that.
Right, and they'll become a lot more pronounced because the issue is not like, are you showing up in the top 3 or on page 10, but in fact, like, what is the one answer that this device is going to spit out, and will you be visible at all? So I think the kind of potential discrimination issues are going to become a lot more pronounced.
So we talked about the infrastructure, monopoly leveraging, information asymmetry, and what was the fourth?
Predatory pricing.
Predatory pricing, yes. So
yeah.
What do you think needs to happen? I know you've written about how Amazon used predatory pricing to grow at a really large rate and was largely unchecked by the antitrust laws because it never recouped its money that it lost from that. So how do you think antitrust law can address predatory pricing moving forward, and what changes need to be made?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with recoupment is we actually just don't know because with these companies that are integrated in so many different lines, there's so many different ways in which they could recoup that wouldn't be immediately discernible to somebody on the outside. They could actually even recoup through raising prices, and that might not be visible. Amazon changes prices of products millions and millions of times a day, and so just even the idea of a kind of a stable price is totally dislodged. They can also, of course, subsidize, right? So right now, AWS is the big cash cow, and so the fact that Amazon is making so much from AWS, it can use to then try and bankrupt its rivals in other lines and other products. So I think the recoupment prong really needs to be revisited. We really need to move away from this assumption that's baked into the current case law that predation is unlikely and irrational and unlikely to ever occur.
And in light of Amazon, not only can it subsidize its profits with its kind of monopoly profits with AWS, almost monopoly profits, subsidize its retail and other lines of business. But we also have seen investors kind of giving it a free pass and allowing it not to make any profits. And what kind of a market does that create when, if you want to launch a company, anyone that Amazon is going to compete against has to also have that ability to not make a profit in order to compete? I mean, is that the state of affairs that we're in?
Yeah, it's pretty striking, and I mean, there has been some good reporting, including from the Capital Forum, showing that this is actually having an effect on innovation, and how this dynamic has changed the mindset of venture capitalists and investors, and the kinds of factors they're considering when choosing whether to invest in companies. They think the investment landscape has changed dramatically because of the competitive advantage that, say, an Amazon has. It's also interesting because I think it also shows this kind of distance between what Wall Street recognizes and what Washington recognizes, right? So Wall Street's pricing Amazon stock at multiples that I would say reflect the market power that Amazon has. And yet in Washington, I think there's still a reluctance to even acknowledge that it has dominance in any line of business. And so you really see, the people, the investors get it in ways that, enforcers are not really getting it yet.
Right, because what could be the rationale for allowing a company to not make a profit and continuing to invest, except for maybe the expectation of
massive recoupment.
Right.
Right.
So what is the first step? What is the top priority of what should be done, do you think, to address some of the problems that we've discussed?
Yeah, I think the issues fall into like two camps broadly. Some of this conduct, I think, could be potentially addressed by, even under current case law or under the current authorities that the agencies have. And I think in those instances, the agencies should be opening investigations and thinking about, using current law, how could they address these competition issues. And then I think there are other areas like predatory pricing, for example, where the case law has gotten to a place where it's very difficult to bring a case. And so in those instances, I think Congress would need to get involved.
And you've also said that anti-monopoly policy can also include regulations and other, not just antitrust law, but other doctrines that can promote anti-monopoly policy. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think we need to be thinking about competition policy more broadly, and all sorts of federal agencies have authorities that affect the competition landscape, right? So USDA has a little office within it that is supposed to address competition issues in the agriculture space. The Small Business Administration, its decisions are affecting competition. Procurement policy with the Defense Department can end up either accelerating concentration or promoting more competition. So I think we need to think about the competition levers embedded across the government and not just in the FTC and DOJ.
Well, Lina, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time today, for talking to me.